A jobless single mother agrees to feed a paralyzed millionaire to support her child. The millionaire treats his new employee with coldness and bitterness, but he never expected what was coming. Her job was to feed him. Falling in love was not in her contract. Maxwell Hawthorne surveyed the Boston skyline from his penthouse apartment, the glass towers reflecting the afternoon sun like the empire he had built from nothing. At 45, he had conquered the tech industry with an iron will and ruthless determination. The merger he had just finalized would add another billion to his fortune, not that he needed it. Money had long ago ceased to be a goal and had become merely a scorecard. "Mr. Hawthorne, your car is waiting," his assistant's voice came through the intercom. "I'll be down in 5, he replied, adjusting his custom-tailored suit in the mirror. Perfect as always. The charity gala was the same as all the others. A parade of Boston's elite vying for his attention, women with practiced smiles, men with calculated handshakes. Maxwell played his part with precision, writing checks that would fund hospitals he would never visit and schools he would never see. The real business happened between champagne flutes and small talk. "Your reputation precedes you, Mr. Hawthorne," Senator Lambert murmured as they stepped aside from the crowd. "Your support on this bill would be appreciated." Maxwell smiled thinly. "And your stance on tech regulation might shift accordingly?" The senator nodded almost imperceptibly, and the deal was done, another piece moving on Maxwell's chessboard. This was the real currency of his world, influence, not dollars. The night concluded as it always did, with Maxwell rejecting invitations for nightcaps and after-parties. Control required discipline. He had never been one for indulgence. The rain had started when he left the venue, making the road slick under the tires of his Bentley. His driver, Thompson, navigated the wet streets with the same careful precision he had employed for the past decade. "Take the expressway," Maxwell instructed, scrolling through emails on his phone. The quarterly reports looked promising. He made a mental note to replace his CFO anyway. The man was getting complacent, and complacency was a luxury Maxwell never afforded anyone, least of all himself. The blare of a horn was his only warning. The flash of headlights, Thompson's. Curse, the violent swerve of the car. Physics took over. Momentum, velocity, the cruel mathematics of impact. Metal twisted, glass shattered, and time stretched into an unbearable moment of clarity before darkness claimed him. Maxwell awoke to the antiseptic smell of a hospital and the mechanical beeping of monitors. The pain was immediate and all-encompassing, but it was the numbness below his waist that truly terrified him. "Mr. Hawthorne," the doctor's voice was steady, professional. "You've been in an accident." The words washed over him like cold water as the doctor explained his condition. Spinal cord injury, paraplegia, permanent. Each word was a hammer blow to the foundation of his existence. "There are excellent rehabilitation facilities," the doctor continued. "With your resources, you'll have access to the best care available." Maxwell stared at the ceiling, not trusting himself to speak. Resources. As if money could fix this, as if all his power and influence could command his legs to move again. The transition from hospital to his Beacon Hill mansion was seamless in its efficiency, but jarring in its reality. The house staff had rearranged the first floor, converting the library into a bedroom suite equipped with medical necessities. Maxwell hated all of it. The hospital bed, the wheelchair, the ramps installed over the marble steps. The physical therapist will arrive at 9 tomorrow, his house manager, Mrs. Winters, informed him, her eyes carefully avoiding his wheelchair. "Fine," Maxwell replied curtly, "and the first of the home health aides starts today. Her credentials are impeccable." "They better be," he muttered. Alone in his new bedroom, Maxwell stared at the portrait of himself that hung on the wall, standing tall at the opening of his company headquarters, the skyline of Boston behind him. A man in control, a man who walked on his own 2 feet. In a surge of rage, he grabbed the nearest object, a crystal paperweight, and hurled it at the painting. It missed, smashing against the wall instead. The sound of shattering crystal brought Mrs. Winters running. "Mr. Hawthorne, are you all right?" "Get out," he growled, the humiliation of his helplessness burning like acid. Days became a blur of physical therapy sessions he endured, with grim determination, and meetings conducted via video conference from his bedroom. His executives noticed the change in him, sharper, harder, more demanding than ever. 2 board members suggested he take time off. He fired them the same day. The parade of home health aides began. The first lasted 3 days before leaving, in tears after Maxwell criticized her technique for transferring him to his wheelchair. The second made it a week before his exacting standards regarding meal preparation drove her away. The third claimed illness after Maxwell's 2 a.m. demand for a complete change of his bedding after a minor spill. "Mr. Hawthorne," Mrs. Winters said one morning, her voice strained with diplomatic patience, "we're having difficulty retaining qualified help." "Then find better qualified help," he snapped. "The agency has informed me they will no longer be sending their staff to this household." For the first time since the accident, Maxwell felt a flicker of concern beneath his anger. "Then try another agency." "That was the third agency, sir." The silence between them stretched uncomfortably. "There is one more option," Mrs. Winters ventured cautiously. "I've received a direct application. The woman has nursing assistant credentials, though. Her recent experience is limited." "Limited experience?" Maxwell scoffed. "Why would I consider that?" "Because at this point, sir, our options are—" She hesitated. "Limited." The interview was scheduled for that afternoon. Maxwell positioned his wheelchair by the window, his back to the door, a power play he had often used in business negotiations. He heard Mrs. Winters enter with the applicant. "Mr. Hawthorne, this is Sarah Mitchell." Maxwell turned his wheelchair slowly, a calculated move to establish dominance. The woman standing before him was not what he expected. In her early 30s, she stood straight, her brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her clothes modest but neat. There was no trace of intimidation in her eyes, just a direct, assessing gaze that caught him off guard. "Your resume is inadequate," he stated, bluntly, waving the paper Mrs. Winters had provided. 2 years as a nursing assistant followed by nothing relevant. "I took time off to raise my son," Sarah replied evenly. "And now? Now I need this job, Mr. Hawthorne. No excuses, no elaborate explanation, just the truth." "Why should I hire someone who's been out of practice?" "Because I won't quit when you try to push me away." The directness of her answer surprised him. "I've read about the turnover rate in this position. I know exactly what I'm walking into." Maxwell's eyes narrowed. "And what exactly do you think that is?" "A job working for a man who's angry at the world and is determined to make everyone around him feel that anger too." She didn't flinch as she said it. "I'm not intimidated by that. I need this job, and you need someone who won't leave at the first harsh word." The room fell silent. Mrs. Winters looked mortified, clearly expecting Maxwell to dismiss the woman immediately. Instead, he found himself intrigued by her audacity. "You have a son?" "Yes, Noah, he's 8. "Where would he stay while you're working here?" "That's my concern, not yours." Maxwell studied her for a long moment. "The position requires living in. There are quarters attached to this suite for the caregiver." "I'm aware. As I said, I've read the job description thoroughly." "And your son?" Sarah hesitated for the first time. "I'd need to make arrangements." Maxwell made his decision, not entirely sure why. Perhaps it was her honesty, or perhaps it was simply that he was running out of options. "The position includes accommodation for you and your son," he said abruptly. "Mrs. Winters will show you the facilities. You start tomorrow." Sarah's expression betrayed a flash of surprise before she composed herself. "Thank you, Mr. Hawthorne." "Don't thank me yet," he replied coldly. "You haven't survived your first day." As Mrs. Winters led Sarah from the room, Maxwell turned his wheelchair back to the window, watching the autumn leaves fall from the trees in his garden. For the first time since the accident, he felt a twinge of something other than anger, curiosity, about whether Sarah Mitchell would indeed be different from the others. He doubted it. They all broke eventually. Sarah arrived at the Hawthorne mansion at precisely 6:45 a.m., 15 minutes earlier than required. Noah stood beside her, clutching his backpack and staring wide-eyed at the imposing structure. "Is this really where we're going to live, Mom?" he whispered. his voice a mixture of awe and apprehension. Sarah squeezed his hand. For now, yes. Remember what we talked about? Noah nodded solemnly. Be quiet, be polite, and stay out of Mr. Hawthorne's way. That's right, Sarah said, taking a deep breath before pressing the intercom button. Mrs. Winters greeted them with practiced efficiency, leading them through the mansion to their quarters, a modest but comfortable two-bedroom suite adjacent to Maxwell's newly converted bedroom. Sarah's heart sank slightly when she realized how close they would be to her employer at all times, but she kept her expression neutral as Mrs. Winters outlined the morning routine. Mr. Hawthorne expects his breakfast at precisely 7:30 a.m. His medication must be administered at 7:15. The physical therapist arrives at 9 CAS, lunch at 12:30 sharp. His business calls typically run from 1:30 to 4 CAS, during which time he is not to be disturbed except for emergencies. Sarah listened carefully, memorizing each detail as Noah explored their new living space. There's a private school 3 blocks away, Mrs. Winters added, handing Sarah a folder. Mr. Hawthorne has arranged for your son's enrollment. The driver will take him each morning and pick him up in the afternoon. Sarah blinked in surprise. That's unexpected. Mr. Hawthorne is thorough, Mrs. Winters replied cryptically. Now I'll show you the medical supplies and equipment. By 7:10 a.m., Noah had been settled with books and his handheld game console, and Sarah stood outside Maxwell's door, steeling herself for the first real test. She knocked once, then entered without waiting for a response, just as Mrs. Winters had instructed. Maxwell Hawthorne was awake, propped up in his bed, scrolling through his tablet. He didn't look up as she entered. You're 2 minutes late, he said. Sarah checked her watch. Actually, I'm 3 minutes early. Maxwell finally glanced up, his eyes cold. My schedule says medication at 7:10. Mrs. Winters informed me 7:15. Sarah replied calmly, approaching his bedside with the medication tray. But I can adjust to 7:10 going forward. See that you do. He looked pointedly at the tray. The blue pill goes first, then the white, not together. Sarah nodded, administering the medication exactly as instructed. Is there a particular reason for that order? Does it matter? He challenged. It might, she replied evenly, if it affects how they work together or how quickly they're absorbed. Medical protocols exist for reasons. A flash of something, perhaps surprise, crossed his face before the mask of indifference returned. The blue pill tastes bitter, the white one doesn't. Satisfied? Sarah simply nodded, continuing her preparations for the morning routine. As she worked, she explained each step, not asking permission but not making assumptions either. Maxwell watched her warily, waiting for a mistake he could pounce on. The first test came during the transfer from bed to wheelchair. She positioned everything correctly, explained what she was going to do, and then executed the move with practiced ease. Your grip is too tight, he complained. Is it painful? She asked, making a minor adjustment without breaking the transfer. No, he admitted reluctantly. Then it's secure, not tight, Sarah corrected, completing the transfer smoothly. Safety first, comfort a close second. Now breakfast is next. Mrs. Winters mentioned you prefer coffee before eating. Maxwell seemed momentarily thrown by her unflappable response. Black, no sugar. The morning progressed with a series of similar challenges. The water for his shower was too hot, though the thermometer showed it at precisely the temperature Mrs. Winters had specified. His shirt had the wrong buttons, though it was the one laid out by the staff. The eggs were overcooked, despite being prepared to the exact specification in his dietary notes. Each complaint was met with the same steady response from Sarah, acknowledgement without apology, adjustment without submission, and a calm continuity that seemed to irritate Maxwell even more than resistance would have. By lunchtime, the battle lines had been clearly drawn. Maxwell was determined to break her composure. Sarah was equally determined not to be broken. Your son is unusually quiet, Maxwell remarked as Sarah prepared his lunch tray. I was expecting disruptions. Noah understands the importance of this job, Sarah replied, arranging the silverware exactly as she'd been instructed. "He's a good kid." "Most parents say that," Maxwell said dismissively. "Few children actually are." Sarah's hands paused briefly. "Have you spent much time around children, Mr. Hawthorne?" "Thankfully, no." "Then perhaps you should reserve judgment," she suggested, placing the tray on his lap table with precision. Maxwell's eyes narrowed. "I don't pay you for your opinions, Ms. Mitchell." "No," she agreed, meeting his gaze directly. "You pay me for my care and expertise. Sometimes that includes perspective." Before he could respond, the door opened, and Noah peered in hesitantly. "Mom, I finished my math book. Can I have lunch now?" Sarah turned, surprised by the interruption. "Noah, remember our agreement about knocking?" "I did knock," he insisted, really quiet. "I didn't want to interrupt if you were doing something important." Maxwell observed the boy with undisguised assessment. Unlike most children who visited the mansion, relatives of business associates, who touched everything with sticky fingers and asked incessant questions, this one stood still, his eyes curious but his demeanor contained. "You finished an entire math workbook in one morning?" Maxwell asked skeptically. Noah nodded. "It was just multiplication and division. I already know those." "What grade are you in?" "Third." Noah glanced at his mother, unsure if he should be speaking directly to Maxwell. "And you find the work unchallenging?" Maxwell pressed. Noah shrugged. "Sometimes. Mom gets me extra books from the library." Sarah intervened gently. "Noah, why don't you go back to our room? I'll bring lunch in a few minutes." After Noah left, Maxwell fixed Sarah with a penetrating stare. "The private school I've arranged is academically rigorous. If he can't keep up—" "He'll keep up," Sarah interrupted with quiet confidence. "Noah's never had trouble with academics. It's sitting still that challenges him sometimes." Maxwell grimaced. "I won't tolerate disruptive behavior in this house." "You won't have to," Sarah assured him, adjusting his lap table. "Now, do you need anything else before I feed Noah lunch?" The afternoon brought the physical therapist, a no-nonsense woman named Diane, who had apparently survived Maxwell's scrutiny. Sarah observed the session discreetly, learning the exercises she would need to help Maxwell with between professional visits. "You're holding back," Diane admonished Maxwell when he refused to push through a particularly difficult stretch. "The pain means it's working." "I'm well aware of what pain means," Maxwell retorted through gritted teeth. Sarah noticed how he forced himself through the remainder of the session, sweat beading on his forehead, his face a mask of determination and fury. When Diane left, Maxwell remained in his wheelchair, breathing heavily, refusing to acknowledge the toll the therapy had taken. "Would you like to rest before your conference calls?" Sarah asked, approaching with a glass of water. "No," he snapped. Sarah set the water within his reach. "I'll be feeding Noah then. Press the call button if you need anything." As she turned to leave, Maxwell's voice stopped her. "Ms. Mitchell." Sarah paused. "Yes?" "The school uniform and supplies. The cost will be deducted from your first paycheck." Sarah's spine stiffened almost imperceptibly. "That wasn't mentioned in our arrangement." "Consider it now mentioned," Maxwell replied coldly. Sarah held his gaze for a long moment. "No." "Excuse me." "No," she repeated firmly. "The living arrangement was part of the employment package. If you've changed the terms, I'll need to reconsider the position." Maxwell's eyes flashed dangerously. "You're in no position to negotiate." "Neither." "Are you?" Sarah countered. "3 agencies have blacklisted you. Good help is hard to find, especially for someone with your reputation." The tension in the room was palpable. Maxwell stared at her with a mixture of anger and reluctant respect. "Fine," he finally said. "The school expenses are covered. But don't mistake this for generosity, Ms. Mitchell. It's merely practical business sense." Sarah nodded once. "Of course, Mr. Hawthorne. Purely practical." As the days passed, a routine began to establish itself. Maxwell continued his campaign of complaints and criticism, but Sarah weathered each storm with unruffled efficiency. Noah adjusted to his new school, bringing home excellent reports and occasionally questions about the man in the wheelchair. "Is he always angry?" Noah asked one evening as Sarah tucked him into bed. Sarah considered her answer carefully. "I think he's hurting, Noah. Sometimes pain makes people angry." "Like when I broke my arm and yelled at you in the hospital?" Sarah smiled, brushing the hair from his forehead. "A little like that, yes, but his pain isn't going away as quickly as yours did." Noah thought about this. "Maybe he needs friends. That always makes me feel better when I'm sad." "Maybe," Sarah agreed, kissing his forehead. "But that's not our job right now. Our job is to help him with the things he can't do for himself." As she turned out the light, Sarah wondered if anyone had ever truly been Maxwell Hawthorne's friend, or if his entire life had been built on transactions and power dynamics. The thought followed her as she checked on him one last time before bed, finding him asleep, his face finally relaxed from its perpetual scowl. In sleep, without the armor of his wealth and intimidation, he looked almost vulnerable, almost human. Sarah adjusted his blanket and quietly left the room, unaware that Maxwell's eyes had opened slightly, watching her retreating figure with a confusion he wasn't yet ready to acknowledge. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah and Noah had moved into the Hawthorne mansion, and Boston's autumn had deepened, painting the city in fiery hues of red and gold. The routine that had begun as a battlefield of wills had settled into something resembling a truce, though Maxwell still tested Sarah daily with exacting standards and arbitrary changes to his preferences. "The doctor called," Sarah informed Maxwell one morning as she prepared his breakfast tray. "He wants to adjust your medication schedule." Maxwell looked up from his tablet with a frown. "What changes?" "The muscle relaxant will be taken only as needed, not on a fixed schedule. And there's a new anti-inflammatory to try." She placed the tray across his lap. "He also mentioned swim therapy." "Absolutely not," Maxwell said immediately. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "The doctor seemed to think it would be beneficial." "I'm not being paraded around a public pool like some sort of spectacle." Sarah buttered his toast with precise movements. "There's a pool in the east wing of this house that's been sitting unused since your accident. It could be private, just you and the therapist." Maxwell's jaw tightened. "That pool was for recreation, not rehabilitation." "Water is water," Sarah replied pragmatically, "and buoyancy would allow movement that's currently difficult on land." Maxwell stared out the window, his expression unreadable. "I'll consider it," he finally said, which was as close to agreement as he ever came. Sarah nodded, knowing better than to press further. "Noah has a half day at school today. He'll be home at noon." Something flickered across Maxwell's face. "Will that interfere with your duties?" "No," Sarah assured him. "He's used to entertaining himself." The mention of Noah seemed to linger in the air between them. Over the past weeks, Maxwell had developed an odd, distant curiosity about the boy. He'd overheard their conversations, sometimes caught glimpses of them in the garden from his window, and occasionally found evidence of the child's presence, a forgotten book, a careful drawing left on a side table. Later that day, as Maxwell was finishing a video conference with his executive team, he heard a distinctive sound from the garden, the thump of a ball against brick. He maneuvered his wheelchair to the window and looked out. Noah was alone in the garden, systematically kicking a soccer ball against a section of wall, retrieving it, and repeating the process with focused determination. Maxwell watched as the boy practiced, his face screwed up in concentration, completely absorbed in his self-assigned task. When Sarah entered the room 20 minutes later, Maxwell was still at the window. "Your son has been kicking that ball for nearly half an hour," he observed. Sarah glanced outside. "He's trying to improve his control. His coach said he needs to work on his non-dominant foot." "There's an actual soccer field beyond the rose garden," Maxwell said abruptly. "It hasn't been maintained recently, but the goals are still there." Sarah looked at him in surprise. "I didn't know that." "It was installed for corporate team-building events," Maxwell explained, his tone dismissive. "A waste of space, really, but it might be better than having him wear away my brick wall." Sarah studied him for a moment. "Would you mind if he used it?" Maxwell shrugged with affected indifference. As long as he doesn't expect me to watch or participate. Of course not, Sarah agreed, though a small smile played at the corner of her lips. The next day, Noah discovered the soccer field with the enthusiastic excitement only an 8-year-old could generate. From his study, Maxwell could hear the boy's exclamations of delight as Sarah showed him the space. "Mom, it's a real field with real goals," Noah's voice carried through the open window. "Can I play here every day, please?" Maxwell found himself listening for Sarah's response. "As long as it's okay with Mr. Hawthorne," she said, her voice carrying on the autumn breeze. "And you still have to finish your homework first." "I will, I promise." Noah's earnest reply was followed by the sound of running feet and the rhythmic thump of the ball. Maxwell returned to his financial reports, telling himself he was merely relieved that the noise had moved farther away from the house. But throughout the afternoon, his attention kept drifting to the window, his ear attuned to the distant sounds of play. 2 days later, during a particular downpour that had trapped everyone indoors, Maxwell was surprised by a tentative knock on his study door. When he called out permission to enter, it was Noah who appeared, hovering uncertainly in the doorway. "Mom said I should ask you directly," the boy began, his words carefully rehearsed. "I was wondering if you have any books about soccer strategies. For kids, I mean." Maxwell regarded him with surprise. "I doubt it. My library tends toward business and economics." Noah's disappointment was evident, though he tried to hide it. "That's okay. Thank you anyway, Mr. Hawthorne." As the boy turned to leave, Maxwell found himself speaking again. "Wait." Noah paused. "There's a tablet in the drawer of that side table," Maxwell directed. "You can use it to look up soccer strategies online. Just don't change any settings." Noah's face lit up. "Really? Thank you." He retrieved the tablet and settled cross-legged on the floor near Maxwell's desk, a respectful distance away but close enough that Maxwell could see his concentrated expression as he navigated to appropriate websites. An hour passed in surprising comfort, the rain pattering against the windows, Noah occasionally murmuring to himself as he discovered new techniques, Maxwell working on quarterly projections. The silence between them was neither strained nor awkward, simply the quiet of two people occupied with their own pursuits in shared space. When Sarah came looking for Noah, she stopped in the doorway, her expression one of barely concealed astonishment at the peaceful scene. "I hope he hasn't been bothering you," she said carefully. "He's been remarkably self-contained," Maxwell replied, watching as Noah reluctantly powered down the tablet. "Can I come back tomorrow?" Noah asked, looking directly at Maxwell. "There's a lot more to learn." Before Maxwell could form a response, his phone rang, his CFO with an urgent matter regarding a potential hostile takeover of one of their subsidiaries. By the time the call ended, Sarah and Noah had disappeared, and Maxwell found himself oddly disappointed by their absence. The next morning, when Sarah arrived with his breakfast, Maxwell noticed she seemed preoccupied. "Is something wrong?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. Sarah hesitated. "Noah's running a fever. Nothing serious, but he'll need to stay home from school today." "I see." Maxwell arranged his face in what he hoped was a neutral expression. "Will you need to adjust your schedule?" "I've set him up in our quarters with everything he needs. I'll check on him between your care routines." Maxwell nodded, then added, "He could use the study again if he wants. It might be more comfortable than being confined to your rooms all day." Sarah's surprise was evident. "That's very generous of you." "It's practical," Maxwell countered. "A sick child recovers faster with adequate distraction and a change. Of scenery, basic healthcare management." The hint of a smile touched Sarah's lips. "Of course, very practical." By mid-morning, Noah had been installed on the leather sofa in Maxwell's study, wrapped in a blanket with the tablet and a stack of books Sarah had procured. Maxwell continued his work, occasionally glancing at the boy, who alternated between drowsy naps and periods of quiet attention to the screen. During one of Sarah's checks on Noah, Maxwell overheard their whispered conversation. "How are you feeling, buddy?" Sarah asked, feeling his forehead. "Better," Noah mumbled. "Mr. Hawthorne showed me how to find videos of professional soccer matches." Did you know there's a whole channel just for that? Is that so? Sarah replied, her voice warm. That was nice of him. He knows a lot of stuff, Noah said matter-of-factly. He explained offside rules to me. They're complicated. Maxwell felt an unexpected warmth spread through his chest at the boy's simple assessment. It had been a brief explanation, hardly the kind of mentoring moment that would matter to most people. Yet Noah had valued it enough to report it to his mother with obvious appreciation. The day progressed with a strange new rhythm. Sarah moved between caring for Maxwell and checking on Noah, the three of them existing in an unexpected harmony that should have felt intrusive to Maxwell, but somehow didn't. When Noah finally fell into a deeper sleep in the late afternoon, Maxwell found himself lowering his voice during business calls and directing the cleaning staff to postpone vacuuming the hallway. That evening, after Noah had been moved back to their quarters and Maxwell was preparing for bed, Sarah lingered after completing her usual evening routine. "Thank you," she said simply, "for letting Noah stay with you today." Maxwell nodded stiffly. It was no inconvenience. Sarah seemed to be considering her next words carefully. "He likes you, you know. He says you don't talk to him like he's a baby." Maxwell felt oddly flustered by this information. Most adults underestimate children's capacity for understanding. "Yes," Sarah agreed. "They do." She paused, then added, "Noah's father was like that, always talking down to him, treating him like he couldn't understand the simplest concepts." It was the first time she had mentioned Noah's father, and Maxwell found himself unexpectedly curious. Is he involved in Noah's life? Sarah's expression hardened slightly. No. He left when Noah was 3, decided fatherhood wasn't compatible with his lifestyle. His loss, Maxwell said before he could stop himself. Sarah's eyes widened slightly at the unexpected sentiment. "Yes," she agreed softly. "It is." A moment of understanding passed between them, brief but profound, before Sarah cleared her throat and returned to her professional demeanor. "Good night, Mr. Hawthorne. The call button is on your nightstand if you need anything." As the days passed, the weather grew colder, and the mansion settled into a new routine. Noah, recovered from his illness, began using the soccer field regularly. Maxwell, who had resisted the idea of swim therapy for weeks, finally relented, allowing the pool to be prepared for his rehabilitation sessions. To everyone's surprise, Noah's innocent question during dinner one evening changed everything. "Mom says you used to play soccer in college," the boy said as Sarah served their meals. Maxwell had recently begun taking dinner at the small table in his suite, with Sarah and Noah joining him in what he insisted was merely a practical arrangement to simplify meal service. Maxwell shot Sarah a questioning look. "Your mother seems remarkably well informed about my past." Sarah shrugged, unapologetic. "Your biography is on your company website, complete with photos of you as captain of the Princeton soccer team." "You were a captain?" Noah asked, eyes wide with admiration. "Were you good?" Maxwell felt a long-forgotten pride stir within him. "I was adequate." "He's being modest," Sarah interjected, setting down a glass of water. "The website says he led his team to 2 championship seasons." "Wow," Noah breathed. "Could you teach me some moves sometime? When you're feeling better, I mean." The request hung in the air, innocent yet loaded with implications about recovery, about future, about involvement. Maxwell opened his mouth to deliver his standard refusal, but what came out instead surprised even him. "Perhaps," he said quietly. "We'll see." The smile that broke across Noah's face was like sunrise after a long night, brilliant and full of possibility. Maxwell caught Sarah's gaze over the boy's head and saw in her eyes a complex mixture of gratitude, hope and something else, something warmer that made him look away quickly, unsettled by the unfamiliar flutter in his chest. That night, alone in his room, Maxwell found himself doing something he hadn't done since the accident. He opened his laptop and typed "wheelchair soccer coaching" into the search bar, the glow of the screen illuminating a face that, for the first time in months, held the faintest ghost of anticipation rather than resignation. December arrived in Boston with swirling snow and bitter winds, transforming the Hawthorne estate into a postcard-perfect winter scene. Inside, another transformation was taking place, one less visible but far more profound. Maxwell sat in his wheelchair at the edge of the indoor pool, watching as Noah practiced diving for weighted rings on the bottom. The boy surfaced with a triumphant splash, holding up a bright orange ring. "Did you see that, Mr. Max? I got it on the first try." The nickname had appeared several weeks ago, and though Maxwell had initially balked at the informality, he'd gradually accepted it, just as he'd accepted so many other changes to his carefully structured existence. "Good technique," Maxwell commented, checking the stopwatch he held. 12 seconds, that's 3 seconds faster than last week." Noah beamed at the praise, paddling to the edge of the pool. "Can we try soccer practice after swimming?" Maxwell glanced at his watch. "Only for 30 minutes. Your mother will be back from her errands by then." What had begun as reluctant tolerance of Noah's presence had evolved into regular coaching sessions. Maxwell couldn't demonstrate the moves himself anymore, but his knowledge of strategy and technique remained intact. To his surprise, he found genuine satisfaction in Noah's rapid improvement. The boy climbed out of the pool, water streaming from his small frame as he wrapped himself in a towel. "Do you think I'll make the travel team next season?" "If you continue practicing consistently," Maxwell replied, his tone matter-of-fact but not unkind. "Talent is only part of success. Discipline makes the difference." Noah nodded seriously, absorbing the advice with the earnestness that had gradually worn down Maxwell's defenses. The boy never complained about the rigorous practice schedule Maxwell had designed, never questioned the repetitive drills, never sought shortcuts. In that way, he reminded Maxwell of himself as a child, determined, focused, unwilling to settle for mediocrity. After Noah had changed back into dry clothes, they moved to the indoor gymnasium that had once been used for Maxwell's private workouts and now served as their improvised soccer training ground. Maxwell positioned his wheelchair near the center of the room, clipboard in hand, as Noah began the series of dribbling drills they had perfected over the weeks. "Tighter control around the cones," Maxwell instructed. "It's precision we're working on today, not speed." Noah adjusted immediately, his movements becoming more deliberate, his focus intensifying. "Better," Maxwell approved. "Now remember what we discussed about anticipation. A good player doesn't just respond to the ball's position, he anticipates where it will be." As they worked, Maxwell found himself fully engaged, the familiar rhythm of coaching temporarily allowing him to forget the limitations of his own body. In these moments, he felt almost whole again, not defined by what he couldn't do, but by what he could still offer. "Mr. Hawthorne." Sarah's voice from the doorway broke his concentration. She stood watching them, a grocery bag in one arm, her expression unreadable. "Mom," Noah called, running to her with excited chatter about his swimming records and the new drill Maxwell had designed. Sarah listened attentively, her eyes moving between her son's animated face and Maxwell's more reserved expression. "That sounds wonderful," she told Noah. "Why don't you go put your swimming things away while I talk to Mr. Hawthorne?" After Noah departed, Sarah approached Maxwell, her steps measured. "You've been spending a lot of time with him." Maxwell couldn't quite interpret her tone. "Is that a problem?" "No," she said quickly. "It's good for him. She hesitated. "I don't want him to get too attached if this is just a temporary distraction for you." The accusation stung with unexpected sharpness. "Is that what you think this is?" Sarah met his gaze directly. "I don't know what this is, Mr. Hawthorne. A few months ago, you couldn't stand the sound of a child in your house. Now you're spending hours coaching my son. People don't usually change that dramatically without reason." Maxwell's jaw tightened. "Perhaps I simply recognized potential worth developing." "Perhaps," Sarah acknowledged, "but Noah doesn't see it as clinically as that. He admires you, talks about you constantly, wants to make you proud." The weight. Her words settled around Maxwell like a heavy cloak. The responsibility of a child's admiration was something he'd never sought, never prepared for. "I'm not trying to replace his father," Maxwell said stiffly. Sarah's expression softened, unexpectedly. "I know that, and I'm grateful for what you've done for him. I just need to know that your interest won't vanish when you're bored or when your condition improves." "My condition isn't going to improve," Maxwell stated flatly. "The prognosis is clear." "Medical science advances every day," Sarah countered, "and even within your current limitations, you're making progress. Your upper body strength has increased significantly. Your independence with daily activities is growing." It was true, though Maxwell rarely acknowledged it. The combination of Sarah's relentless encouragement and his own stubborn determination had yielded results that surprised even his doctors. "My point," Sarah continued, "is that your life will continue to change. I need to know that your commitment to Noah won't change with it." Maxwell studied her face, the directness of her gaze, the concern etched in the slight furrow of her brow, the protective love of a mother looking out for her child. Something shifted in his chest, a recognition that her question deserved more than a defensive response. "Noah is," he began, searching for words that felt foreign on his tongue. "He's a remarkable child. I give you my word that my commitment to his development is not a passing interest." The tension in Sarah's shoulders eased visibly. "Thank you," she said simply. Then, with a small smile, "He says you're tougher than his school coach." "His school coach is evidently too concerned with participation trophies and not enough with actual skill development," Maxwell replied dryly. Sarah's laugh was unexpected and musical, a sound that Maxwell realized he'd been unconsciously trying to elicit more frequently in recent weeks. It did something to the atmosphere around them, lightening it, warming it. That evening, as Sarah prepared dinner in the kitchen adjacent to Maxwell's suite, he found himself watching her movements, the efficient grace with which she chopped vegetables, the slight sway of her body as she moved between counters, the way she absently tucked strands of hair behind her ear. When had he started noticing such details? "The board wants me to make an appearance at the company holiday party," he said abruptly. Sarah looked up in surprise. "That's wonderful. You haven't left the estate in months." "It's a publicity stunt," Maxwell said dismissively, "a show of strength to reassure the shareholders." "Still," Sarah persisted, "it would be good for you to get out, see your colleagues." Maxwell frowned. "I'll need assistance." Sarah wiped her hands on a towel. "I can accompany you if that's what you're asking." "It is," Maxwell confirmed, though the words felt inadequate for what he was truly requesting, her steadying presence, her quiet confidence that had somehow become essential to his own. "Then I'll need to find someone to watch Noah," she mused. "He can come along," Maxwell suggested, surprising himself. "There's a children's area at these events, games, movies, that sort of thing." Sarah regarded him with undisguised curiosity. "So you want Noah to come to your corporate party?" Maxwell shifted uncomfortably in his wheelchair. "It's a practical solution, and he might enjoy seeing the headquarters. There's a rather impressive model of the entire Hawthorne technology ecosystem in the lobby." A slow smile spread across Sarah's face, one that made Maxwell feel both exposed and warmed. "I'm sure he'd love that," she said softly. The night of the party arrived with a fresh snowfall that blanketed the city in pristine white. Maxwell wore a custom-tailored suit that Sarah had arranged with his personal stylist, the formality of the attire a sharp contrast to the casual clothes he'd grown accustomed to wearing at home. "You look," Sarah paused in the doorway of his bedroom, her eyes taking in his appearance, "like the Maxwell Hawthorne from the magazine covers." Maxwell adjusted his cufflinks, a nervous gesture he couldn't quite suppress. "Is that good or bad?" Sarah smiled. "Just different from the man who helps my son with his math homework in sweatpants." The observations settled between them, acknowledging the evolution that had taken place over the months. Maxwell found himself equally arrested by Sarah's appearance. She'd exchanged her usual practical attire for a simple but elegant navy dress that highlighted the graceful curve of her neck and the warm tone of her skin. "You look," he began, then stopped, uncertain of his territory. "Professional enough to be your healthcare assistant for the evening," she supplied, misinterpreting his hesitation. "Beautiful," Maxwell finished quietly. A flush of color rose to Sarah's cheeks, and for a moment the air between them seemed charged with a current neither had acknowledged before. The moment was broken by Noah's entrance, the boy tugging at the collar of his dress shirt, but beaming with excitement about riding in the fancy car to the giant building where Mr. Max worked. The company headquarters blazed with holiday lights, the lobby transformed with tasteful decorations, and the subtle sounds of classical Christmas music. Maxwell felt a surge of nerves as the car pulled up to the entrance. This would be his first public appearance since the accident, his first time presenting himself to his business world as a man in a wheelchair. Sarah, as if sensing his tension, placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. "Remember, they work for you, not the other way around." The reminder centered him, bringing back a shadow of the confidence that had once been as much a part of him as his custom suits and corner office. With Sarah pushing his wheelchair and Noah walking beside them, they entered the building. The initial reaction was exactly as Maxwell had predicted, the sudden hush as he was recognized, the poorly disguised shock at his changed appearance, the quick recovery as people remembered their professional masks. But there was something else too, something he hadn't anticipated, a genuine warmth from longtime employees, handshakes that lingered a moment longer than necessary, eyes that held real concern rather than mere curiosity. "Maxwell, it's damn good to see you." Richard Simmons, his COO, approached with unmistakable sincerity. "The place hasn't been the same." Maxwell accepted the greeting with a nod, introducing Sarah and Noah with a formality that felt increasingly at odds with their actual place in his life. As they moved through the crowd, he noticed the curious glances directed not just at his wheelchair, but at the woman and child accompanying him. Maxwell Hawthorne, notoriously private and unattached, arriving with what looked remarkably like a family unit. The evening progressed smoothly until Maxwell found himself cornered by James Westfield, the chairman of his board, and an old family friend who had known Maxwell since childhood. "She's quite lovely," James commented, watching as Sarah helped Noah select food from the buffet across the room. "How long has she been working for you?" "A few months," Maxwell replied neutrally. James's eyebrows rose. "Really? The way you look at her, I assumed." He cleared his throat. "Well, it's good to see you connecting with someone, in whatever capacity." Maxwell frowned. "She's a valued employee, professional and competent." "Of course," James agreed, though his knowing smile suggested he wasn't convinced. "And the boy seems quite attached." "To you?" Before Maxwell could respond, his assistant, Margaret, appeared at his side with a tablet. "Mr. Hawthorne, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's an issue with the Tokyo office that needs your immediate attention." Maxwell excused himself, wheeling to a quiet corner with Margaret to address the crisis. By the time it was resolved, he looked up to find Sarah standing nearby, concern evident in her expression. "Is everything all right?" she asked. "Just business," he assured her. "Where's Noah?" "In the children's room, fully entranced by the virtual reality setup." She hesitated. "We can leave whenever you're ready. You look tired." Maxwell was indeed exhausted, the emotional toll of the evening greater than he'd anticipated, but something compelled him to say, "There's one more thing I'd like to show you before we go." He led her to the private elevator, instructing it to take them to the top floor. The doors opened directly into his executive suite, dark now except for the city lights streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "This was your office," Sarah said softly, taking in the expansive space with its commanding view of Boston Harbor. "Still is, technically," Maxwell replied, "though I've been working remotely." Sarah moved to the windows, gazing out at the panorama of lights reflecting on the dark water. "It's beautiful." "Yes," Maxwell agreed, though he was looking at her, silhouette against the glass rather than the view beyond. Sarah turned, catching his gaze, and something in the air between them shifted. The professional boundaries that had kept them safely separated, suddenly tissue-thin and fragile. "Why did you bring me up here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Maxwell moved his wheelchair closer, stopping an arm's length away. "I'm not entirely sure," he admitted. "Perhaps to show you the world I came from." "The world you'll go back to," she said, a question lingering in her tone. "I don't know if that's possible anymore." The confession cost him something to make. "I'm not the same person who commanded this space." Sarah studied him, her eyes soft in the dim light. "No, you're not," she agreed. "You're more human now, more real." The words touched something deep within him, a recognition of truth that both terrified and liberated. Without conscious decision, he reached for her hand, and she allowed him to take it, her fingers warm against his palm. "Sarah," he began, her name feeling new on his tongue. The moment shattered with the chime of the elevator, followed by the doors sliding open to reveal James Westfield, surprise registering on his face as he took in the scene before him. "Maxwell," he said, his gaze moving between them, "I was just looking for you to say good night." Sarah withdrew her hand quickly, stepping back with a professionalism that felt like a wall being erected between them. "I should check on Noah," she said, her voice steady despite the flush on her cheeks. "Excuse me, Mr. Westfield." As she disappeared into the elevator, James turned to Maxwell with raised eyebrows. "Just an employee, hmm?" Maxwell didn't answer, his mind still caught in the moment that had been interrupted, in the possibility that had hovered tantalizingly close, before slipping away. On the ride home, the car was filled with Noah's excited chatter about the virtual reality games and the model in the lobby, but the space between Maxwell and Sarah hummed with an unspoken tension, with questions neither was ready to voice. That night, after Noah was asleep and the house had settled into silence, Maxwell sat by his bedroom window, watching the snow fall and thinking about the woman whose quarters lay just beyond his wall, wondering if she too was awake, if she too was contemplating the shifting landscape between them and the uncertain territory that lay ahead. January brought with it not only a new year, but a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the Hawthorne mansion. The almost moment in Maxwell's office had created an undercurrent of awareness between him and Sarah that neither acknowledged directly, but both felt acutely. Their interactions remained outwardly professional, yet charged with an electricity that made even the most mundane exchanges feel significant. "The physical therapist thinks you're ready for the advanced mobility exercises," Sarah informed Maxwell. One morning, reviewing his medical chart with practiced efficiency. "Does she?" Maxwell replied, watching Sarah's face more intently than the information she was sharing. Sarah met his gaze briefly before looking back at the chart. "Yes. She's quite impressed with your progress." What remained unspoken was how much of that progress was due to Sarah's unwavering belief in his capabilities, her refusal to let him surrender to limitations, her quiet insistence that he could do more than the doctors had predicted. In the months since she had entered his life, Maxwell had regained not just physical strength, but something far more valuable, a reason to fight, to improve, to envision a future beyond the confines of his injury. Noah burst into the room, interrupting the charged silence. "Mom, Mr. Max, look what came in the mail." He waved an official-looking envelope emblazoned with the logo of the New England Youth Soccer Association. "What is it, buddy?" Sarah asked, welcoming the distraction. "I made the travel team," Noah exclaimed, his face alight with joy. "Coach says I can start training with them next week." "Let me see that," Maxwell said, reaching for the letter. He scanned it quickly, a smile spreading across his face. "Congratulations, Noah. This is well deserved." "It's because of you," Noah said, earnestly. "All those extra practices and drills you made me do." Maxwell felt a swell of pride, unlike anything he'd experienced in his business career. This achievement, this child's happiness, somehow meant more than any corporate acquisition or stock price increase ever had. "You did the work," Maxwell told him seriously. "I just provided direction." Noah threw his arms around Maxwell in an impulsive hug that caught the man completely off guard. For a moment, Maxwell froze, uncertain how to respond to this uninhibited display of affection. Then, slowly, he raised his arms and returned the embrace, his eyes meeting Sarah's over the boy's head. The tenderness in her expression made his chest tighten with an emotion he was still learning to recognize, a complex mixture of gratitude, joy, and something deeper that frightened and exhilarated him in equal measure. That afternoon, while Noah was at school and Sarah was out shopping for groceries, the doorbell rang. Mrs. Winters answered it, then appeared in Maxwell's study with an uncomfortable expression. "Mr. Hawthorne, you have visitors. Mr. James Westfield and Ms. Diana Hawthorne." Maxwell looked up sharply, My sister is here? Yes, sir. Shall I show them in? Maxwell nodded, his jaw tightening. Diana's visits were rare and usually precipitated by some crisis or confrontation. Combined with James's presence, this could only mean trouble. Diana swept into the room with the confident grace that marked all the Hawthorne women, her designer coat dusted with snow, her expression a careful mask of familial concern. James followed more sedately, nodding a greeting to Maxwell. Maxwell, Diana said, bending to kiss his cheek with practiced affection. You look well. What brings you here, Diana? Maxwell asked directly, bypassing pleasantries. You rarely venture to Boston in winter. Diana exchanged a glance with James before settling elegantly into an armchair. Can't a sister simply visit her brother? She could, Maxwell agreed dryly, if that sister had ever done so before without an agenda. Diana sighed, dropping the pretense. Fine, James called me after the holiday party. He's concerned, I'm concerned. About what exactly? About your involvement with your home health aide, Diana stated bluntly, and her son. Maxwell's face hardened. My relationship with my employees is not your concern. It is when it affects Hawthorne Technologies, James interjected gently. Maxwell, there's talk. The board is questioning your judgment. Shareholders are nervous. Because I treat my healthcare provider with respect? Maxwell demanded. Because you look at her like she's your salvation, Diana countered. Because you're forming an attachment to her child. Because you took them to the corporate holiday party and disappeared into your private office with her. Maxwell felt a surge of anger. Have you had me under surveillance, James? James had the grace to look uncomfortable. Of course not, but people notice things, Maxwell, they talk, and in your position, perception matters. What exactly are you suggesting? Maxwell asked coldly. Diana leaned forward. We think it would be best if you hired a different caregiver, a professional service with proper boundaries, someone without complications. The rage that rose in Maxwell was sudden and overwhelming. Get out, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Maxwell, be reasonable, James began. Get out! Maxwell rarely raised his voice, making the impact all the more startling when he did. You have no right to dictate how I live my life or who I allow into it. Diana stood, her composure slipping slightly. This isn't just about you, Maxwell. It's about the family name, the company reputation. I built that company, Maxwell interrupted. I earned that reputation. And if having a relationship with Sarah Mitchell damages either, then perhaps neither was worth protecting. The silence that followed his words was profound, charged with the realization that he had just openly acknowledged what he had been denying for months, that his feelings for Sarah went beyond professional boundaries. So it is a relationship, James said quietly. Maxwell hesitated, then answered honestly. I don't know what it is yet, but I know it's more important to me than stock prices or shareholders, to opinions. Diana looked genuinely shocked. You can't be serious. Maxwell, she's your employee. She's from a completely different world. What could you possibly have in common? More than you might think, Maxwell replied, and I'm beginning to believe that what makes us different might be just as valuable as what makes us similar. Diana's expression hardened. She's using you, Maxwell, can't you see that? A single mother with limited prospects suddenly has access to one of the wealthiest men in New England. It's the oldest story in the book. Something dangerous flashed in Maxwell's eyes. If you say one more word against her, Diana, I will cut you out of my life completely. Don't test me on this. The threat hung in the air, all the more powerful because both Diana and James knew it wasn't empty. Maxwell Hawthorne had never been a man to make idle threats. You're not thinking clearly, Diana said finally, gathering her coat. When you come to your senses, call me. After they left, Maxwell sat in silence, his thoughts churning. His sister's accusations had stirred doubts he had refused to acknowledge. Was Sarah merely tolerating his affection because of her financial situation? Was he confusing gratitude with deeper feelings? Were his emotions clouding his judgment? The sound of the front door opening announced Sarah's return. Maxwell could hear her chatting with Mrs. Winters, the rustle of grocery bags, the domestic sounds that had become the soundtrack to his new life. He wheeled himself to the doorway of his study, watching as she moved efficiently through the kitchen, putting things away, her movements graceful and purposeful. As if sensing his presence, she looked up, offering a smile that faltered when she saw his expression. "Is everything all right? We need to talk," Maxwell said, his tone more formal than it had been with her in weeks. Sarah's face registered concern as she followed him back to his study, closing the door behind them. "What's happened?" Maxwell positioned his wheelchair. Behind his desk, a subconscious move to create distance. "My sister and the chairman of my board visited today." Sarah waited, sensing there was more. "They suggested that your continuing employment here might be problematic." Sarah's expression stilled. "I see. And you agree?" "I don't know," Maxwell admitted, the words costing him. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer." She nodded, her posture straight, her face composed but for the wariness in her eyes. "Are you here because of my money?" The question was blunt, almost cruel in its directness. Sarah flinched as if he had struck her. "Excuse me." "It's a simple question," Maxwell pressed, though it felt like anything but simple. "You came here because you needed a job. You've stayed because the compensation is substantial. But is there more to it than that? Or am I simply a meal ticket to you and Noah?" The color drained from Sarah's face, replaced by a flush of anger. "How dare you?" "Just answer the question," Maxwell insisted, his own pain making him push harder than he intended. "No," Sarah said, her voice tight with controlled fury. "I'm not here because of your money, Maxwell. Yes, I needed the job initially. Yes, the salary has provided security for Noah that we haven't had before. But if you think for 1 second that I've stayed because of financial gain, then you don't know me at all." Maxwell watched her carefully. "Then why have you stayed? Most people can't tolerate me for more than a few weeks. You've endured months." "Endured?" Sarah repeated, incredulous. "Is that what you think I've been doing? Enduring you? Like you're some burden I've been carrying for a paycheck?" "Haven't you?" Maxwell challenged. Sarah's eyes flashed. "I stayed because beneath all that arrogance and anger, I saw a man worth knowing. Because despite your best efforts to push everyone away, you showed kindness to my son when he needed it. Because I watched you fight every day to regain your independence without complaint, without self-pity. I stayed because somewhere along, the way I stopped seeing Maxwell Hawthorne, difficult patient, and started seeing just Max, the man I—" She stopped abruptly. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. "The man you what?" Maxwell asked quietly. Sarah shook her head, stepping back. "It doesn't matter. Clearly you've made up your mind about me." "I haven't," Maxwell countered, wheeling out from behind the desk. "That's the problem, Sarah. I don't know what to think anymore. I don't know what this is between us. I don't know if what I feel is real or if it's just gratitude or dependency or some psychological response to my condition." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "What do you feel, Maxwell?" The question hung in the air, demanding honesty he wasn't sure he was capable, half giving, but the alternative, watching her walk away believing he thought the worst of her, was suddenly unbearable. "I feel," he began, then stopped, searching for words. "I feel alive when you're in the room. I feel like a whole person, not just a broken body in a wheelchair. I feel proud when Noah accomplishes something we've worked on together. I feel terrified that my feelings for you might be one-sided, or worse, that they might destroy what you've built for yourself." Sarah took a step closer, her anger visibly ebbing. "Your sister thinks I'm after your money." "Diana sees the worst in everyone," Maxwell said dismissively. "It's a family trait." A ghost of a smile touched Sarah's lips, one you're gradually overcoming. Maxwell reached for her hand, relieved when she allowed him to take it. "I don't want to lose you, Sarah, but I don't want to hold you back either. You deserve more than being seen as the woman who takes care of the rich cripple." Sarah's free hand came up to touch his face, a gesture of such tender intimacy that Maxwell felt his chest constrict. "Is that how you see yourself?" "It's how the world sees me," he admitted. And by extension, how they'll see you if we... If we what? Sarah pressed gently. Maxwell met her gaze directly. If we acknowledge that this is more than an employer-employee relationship, if we admit that somewhere along the way we became a family, you, me, and Noah. The word family hung between them, weighted with significance and possibility. And, is that what you want? Sarah asked softly. To be a family? Before Maxwell could answer, the study door burst open and Noah ran in, his school backpack still on his shoulders. Mom, Mr. Max, guess what? I got an A on my science project, the one Mr. Max helped me with about kinetic energy and soccer kicks. The cease. Interruption should have broken the moment, but somehow it only crystallized the truth Maxwell had been struggling to articulate. This child's excitement, this sharing of triumphs both large and small, this belonging to something larger than himself, this was what he wanted, what he needed, what he hadn't known he was missing until Sarah and Noah had filled the void. That's wonderful, Noah, Sarah said, her eyes still on Maxwell's face. Mr. Hawthorne and I were just having an important conversation. Noah looked between them, his young face suddenly serious. Are you leaving? Is it because of me making too much noise in the house? No, Sarah assured him quickly. No one's leaving. Actually, Maxwell interjected, your mother and I were discussing a change in our arrangement. Noah's face fell. What kind of change? Maxwell took a deep breath, looking to Sarah for permission to continue. Her slight nod gave him courage. I was thinking, Maxwell said carefully, that perhaps your mother could be more than my caregiver, that perhaps we could be a different kind of family. Noah's brow furrowed in confusion. Like you'd be my stepdad or something. The directness of the question startled a laugh from Maxwell. Eventually, perhaps, if your mother would consider it. For now, I was thinking we might start with dinner, the three of us. Somewhere nice, not as employer and employee, but as... He hesitated, looking at Sarah. As people who care deeply about each other, Sarah finished, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Noah considered this seriously. So like a date, but with me too? Exactly like that, Maxwell confirmed. A slow grin spread across Noah's face. Cool. Can we go to that fancy Italian place with the pizza oven you can see from the table? Absolutely, Maxwell agreed, relief and joy washing through him in equal measure. After Noah had gone to change out of his school clothes, Sarah turned to Maxwell, her expression a mixture of hope and caution. Are you sure about this? There will be talk. Your sister, your board, the press. Let them talk, Maxwell said firmly. I've spent my entire life worrying about perceptions and appearances. Look where it got me, surrounded by people who only cared about what I could do for them, not who I actually was. And what changed? Sarah asked. Maxwell smiled, taking her hand again. I did, because of you. Because you saw me at my worst, and didn't flinch. Because you challenged me when I needed it and supported me when I couldn't stand on my own. Because you showed me that there are things more valuable than power or wealth or corporate success. Sarah stepped closer until she was standing between his knees, looking down at him with an openness that took his breath away. Like what? Like family, Maxwell said simply. Like love. The word hung between them, finally spoken aloud. Sarah's hand trembled slightly in his. It won't be easy, she warned. People will judge. They'll say I took advantage of you. They'll say you're not thinking clearly. Then they don't know either of us very well, Maxwell replied. I've never thought more clearly in my life. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he reached up to draw her closer. Sarah came willingly, bending down until their lips met in a kiss that felt like both an ending and a beginning. The end of loneliness, of isolation, of barriers carefully constructed and fiercely maintained. The beginning of something neither had been looking for, but both had found against all odds. When they separated, Sarah rested her forehead against his, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Maxwell Hawthorne, are you going soft? Only with you, he promised, pulling her down for another kiss. "Only with you." Outside, snow began to fall again, blanketing Boston in pristine white, covering old tracks and creating fresh landscapes yet to be explored. Inside the Hawthorne mansion, a once cold house had become a home, warmed by the presence of an unexpected family forged in challenge, strengthened by acceptance, and bound together by love that had found them when they weren't looking, but exactly when they needed it most. 3 months later, as spring brought new growth to the estate gardens, Maxwell sat in his customized sports wheelchair on the sidelines of Noah's first travel team soccer match. Sarah stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, as they watched Noah execute a perfect pass, one they had practiced for hours on the field behind the mansion. "He's good," Sarah said proudly. "He's exceptional," Maxwell corrected, covering her hand with his. The diamond ring on her finger caught the sunlight, a recent addition following a proposal that had surprised no one but had moved everyone, including the normally stoic Mrs. Winters to tears. The tabloids had had their day when news of their engagement broke. Tech titan to wed caregiver, the headlines had screamed. Hawthorne air shocks society with commoner bride-to-be. Maxwell had weathered the storm with unexpected calm. His priorities fundamentally shifted from what others thought to what truly mattered. The board had eventually come around, especially when Maxwell's renewed engagement with the company had led to their most innovative product launch in years. Diana remained coolly distant, but had grudgingly acknowledged that Sarah seemed less opportunistic than anticipated. None of it mattered now as they watched Noah play, as they planned their future together, as they built something neither had believed possible after their respective disappointments and losses. "I never thought I'd have this again," Sarah said quietly, watching Noah celebrate a goal with his teammates. "Have what?" Maxwell asked, looking up at her. "Happiness," she answered simply. "A complete family, someone to share both the struggles and the joys with." Maxwell squeezed her hand, his throat tight with emotion. "I never thought I'd have it at all. I didn't even know what I was missing until you and Noah showed me." On the field, Noah scored a goal, immediately turning to search for them in the crowd of parents. When he spotted Maxwell and Sarah, his face lit up with pure joy as he gave them a thumbs up, their private signal of success developed during countless practice sessions. Maxwell returned the gesture, a sense of fulfillment washing over him that no business achievement had ever provided. In that moment, watching Noah celebrate with his team while holding Sarah's hand, Maxwell knew with absolute certainty that his life hadn't ended with his accident. It had merely been redirected towards something infinitely more precious than the empire he had built. "We should start planning the wedding soon," Sarah said, her eyes still on her son. "Noah's already practicing his role as ring-bearer." Maxwell smiled. "Whatever you want. Big, small, elaborate, simple. It doesn't matter to me as long as at the end of it, you're my wife." Sarah leaned down to kiss him, no longer concerned about who might be watching or what they might think. "Who would have thought," she murmured against his lips, "that the most difficult patient in Boston would turn out to be the love of my life?" "I was never difficult," Maxwell protested with mock indignation, "merely particular." Sarah's laugh, that musical sound he had come to cherish, rang out in the spring air. "Particular, demanding, exacting, impossible," she enumerated teasingly. "Determined," Maxwell corrected, pulling her down for another kiss. Determined to push everyone away until someone too stubborn to be pushed arrived. As they drove home after the game, Noah chattering excitedly about his performance. From the back seat, Maxwell looked at the woman beside him, and the child who had somehow become his son in all the ways that mattered. The mansion that had once felt like a prison now beckoned as a sanctuary, a place where 3 separate lives had intertwined to create something stronger and more beautiful than any could have been alone. Later that night, as Sarah slept peacefully beside him, Maxwell reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The accident that had seemed like the end had actually been a beginning. The paralysis that had taken his ability to walk had ultimately led him to a path he would never have found on his feet. The vulnerability he had fought so hard against had become the very thing that allowed him to receive the love he had never known he needed. Maxwell Hawthorne, once defined by his wealth and power, had discovered that true richness lay in the connections he had formed, in the love he had found, in the family he was building. And as he drifted towards sleep, his hand entwined with Sarah's, he knew with perfect clarity that he wouldn't trade this life, wheelchair and all, for any version of his old existence. He had lost the ability to stand, but in falling, he had finally learned how to rise. Fim da Historia. Hey listeners, we hope you were touched by Maxwell and Sarah's journey of love and redemption. For more heart-stirring stories like this one, we've prepared a special playlist of equally captivating narratives. You'll find it by clicking to your left. If you enjoyed this emotional roller coaster, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day we bring you unique stories that explore life's complexities and the power of human connection. What did you think about Maxwell's transformation? Was there a moment that particularly moved you? We're eagerly waiting to hear your thoughts in the comment section below.